Hi everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Rabbi Daniel Rowe. Many of you, I can see faces that I do know, so I think the majority of you. So I'm part of the educational team here in Asia Global, and I was many years in Asia UK. My academic work is in philosophy. I'm completing a PhD in that. But we're talking today about authenticity of the Torah. So you've had a talk already on the 7 wonders of Jewish history, the idea that Torah contains unlikely prophecies, the sorts of things that humans would not have predicted. And not only are they made, which would be strange that a human could have thought it could happen, but they actually do happen. The bizarre history of the Jewish people. I'm not going to review that class. I don't know if you have any immediate burning questions on it. I'm happy to take some. But if not, the topic of our class is the other part of Judaism. Judaism is largely based on the claim that the Torah is divine text, and that's its base of its authority. If we wear tzitzis, we don't do it because some human said so. We do it because God created the universe, wants the people of Israel to do it. But the other part is the Oral Torah, or what we call the Oral Torah, which particularly is the authority of Mishnah, of Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, all of this. And in theory, even if one believes the Torah is divine, where does the authority of everything else come from? That's the question we want to touch upon here. And it turns out that there is a lot of confusion about this. A lot of people understand that when we say there's an Oral Torah, a Torah Sheba'al Peh, what we mean is that essentially everything in the Mishnah or the Gemara, I'll just define what those are, but everything in them was transmitted at Sinai, and that's a prerequisite to Jewish belief, and that's not an accurate portrayal according to the majority opinion. Mishnah means the very first writing down of the law and the debates around this Torah Sheba'al Peh, this oral tradition, which occurs shortly, roughly in the beginning of 2nd century BC. And then the Gemara, which is the elaboration on the Mishnah. The Mishnah was designed to be a memorized text. It's very condensed. And the Gemara, the Talmud, which occupies the main body of any yeshiva learning and is always the first starting point of the analysis of Jewish law, which is written in the 5th or 6th century BC. 5th or 6th century CE in the Common Era. So both are Common Era, right? So these texts, where's the authority drawn from? What are they? So very, very roughly, what I want to do here is go through what they are. I want to go through why they only emerge so late. I want to go through what the authority of each part of what they are is, what was transmitted at Sinai, what wasn't, how we know, why we rely on it, why it's reliable. And also another question that's immediately part, anything that's transmitted, anything that's meant to be a part of Torah, how can there be debates about them? And then how do we know we've got the right answer? So all of that are the topics that we want to address here. But primarily what we want to really understand is, even if we think the Torah is true, why does this follow? So in order to do this, we need to really break down what is it that we mean by the Oral Torah. Okay, but before we get there, are people satisfied with this as our basic topic area? That any things within it you'd like to also make sure that we try and touch and cover in our 40 minutes or so together? If not, then let's get to work and let's break down the Oral Torah into 3 categories. If you read Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah and other works of his, you could sub-break it into slightly more into 5, but they fall into these 3. The first is called, a term you'll come across, the Halacha. I'm going to just put the initials here, Moshe Sinai. Okay? This literally means the orally transmitted piece. Okay? From Moses at Sinai. And this is the bit where people can have a legitimate question. How do we know some things were orally transmitted? I'll come back to that. The second category is interpretation. And the third category is legislation. Okay, we're going to look at each of these. Okay, if you open a Mishnah, a Talmud, anything, you have certain things that are reported as given to Moses at Sinai, they are the now, which I'm going to add an extra word to this in a second. Then you've got interpretations and legislation. Orally transmitted, the Halacha l'Moshe Sinai, I would put into this term, they are definitions. Okay, I'm going to explain what this is. So if you read the Torah, and all you had was the Torah, you would struggle to know how to put it into practice. Largely because we don't have definitions for words that are used. For example, in the Shema, in the paragraph we talk about the oneness of God and loving Hashem, we know how to do that, let's say. Teach it to your children, we know how to do that. But then it says you should write them as an os, as a sign on your hands, and totophos between your eyes. I'm using Ashkenazic pronunciation, right? But what is a sign on your hand and what are totophos between your eyes? So clearly, whoever was receiving this text had to have definitions to tell them what to do. Even a secular scholar would have to agree this is true. Even somebody who thinks this was written centuries later by a bunch of humans would still have to agree that people knew what these words meant. Either because everybody who spoke the language knew what those words meant, or because whoever was giving the text was instructing people in what the words meant. But one way or another, external to the text, has to be a definition of what this means. It says on Shabbat you cannot do malacha. You translate that as work, let's say. Maybe more accurately, creative work. But there's penalties for people who break Shabbat. Somebody receiving that text had to know what it meant. Courts had to know how to apply it. They had to have a basic ballpark, what's included and what's not included, what type of work is forbidden. If I jump up and down, is that forbidden? Is, what is included and what's not included? And so on. So definitions are the things that are orally transmitted to Moshe at Sinai. Rambam makes an additional claim that whenever you will never find debates around the things that were actually transmitted to Moshe at Sinai. Not everyone agrees with him on that. Everyone agrees that's generally true. There may be some room for wiggle, but generally speaking, there won't be debates. And that's because, again, actually, you don't need a body of rabbis to transmit this. The people will transmit it one generation to the next. You'll grow up in a home and you'll see what tefillin are, you'll see totophos. Okay, if you have questions about them, you'll go to the authorities. But broadly speaking, all this means is that when the Torah uses terms, those terms come with definitions. The second category is interpretation. Interpretation, for those who are familiar with Talmud, is when you typically start to use what's called derashot, tools to derive meanings from the text. Where do the rabbis get the right to interpret the text? And are those interpretations all the way back? So Maimonides says very clearly, Rambam, again, and this is not his idea, he just we usually quote him because he codifies everything, makes it very clear, but it's not his idea, is that no, this was not given at Moshe at Sinai. In his 14 roots, shroshim, to the book of mitzvahs, he says it very clearly on the second one. In the book of Mamrim, the laws of rebels, he says it very clearly in the second chapter. These were not given to Moshe at Sinai. Moshe himself may have interpreted the text of the people, but the interpretation of the text is not given at Sinai. What is given at Sinai? First, I'll tell you what is maybe the parameters of interpretation. But the authority, where do they get the authority to interpret? The authority comes from the Torah itself. In Devarim, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, in the Psukim, the verses 8, 9, 10, 11, Ki yipolem imcha davar. If something is unclear to you, bein dam ledam, there's lots of laws to do with blood, right? Between different types of blood. Bein din ledin, between different types of legal cases, civil and criminal cases. Divrei rivos, interpersonal quarrels, right? Or nega. And nega can actually mean one person hits another, but it's more used in Torah for specific afflictions that come with they're called saras, with a whole bunch of laws around them, 2 sedras in Torah dedicated to them. All these different potential categories, and you are confused. You don't know what to do. The text is not clear enough. It's a case that doesn't neatly fall into a category in the Torah. In fact, the Torah rarely gives the abstract law. It usually gives examples and cases and what to do. So now you're confused. You don't know what to do. So what do? So the Torah says you get up and go to the place where God will rest his name. At that point, the Torah meant that where the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle was, which later crossed the Jordan, and settled in Gilgal, and eventually moved to Shiloh, and eventually got to Jerusalem, where it became a permanent house. So wherever that home of God is, get up and go there and ask the Kohanim, the priests, if it's laws to do with them, presumably the Levites, if it's something to do with them, and the shofet, the judges, you've got to ask these people. And what they tell you to do, the Torah then says you can't deviate to the right or the left, and it says two things. Al pi Torah sheyarucha, according to the Torah that they teach you, and the mitzvah they tell you to do. So we have two different things they can give. They can give interpretation of the law, and they can tell you to do things. They can give some the other way around, but in principle you've got interpretation and legislation. This body of people who will sit in the temple, priests who will discuss certain types of laws, judges who will discuss others, they have the right, they are authorized by the Torah itself to interpret and, where necessary, to tell you to do things, and you have to follow what they say and do not deviate right or left. Now, who are these people? We know who priests are, but who are the judges? The answer is, we know it from the Torah itself. In Parshas Ba'alai, God tells Moses to go and appoint 70 elders. And he goes and does so. And those elders are referenced throughout Torah. They are referenced in the book of Yoshua, book of Joshua, the first of the continuation of Torah books in the biblical canon, in Nach. And they're referenced at the beginning, and they're referenced at the end. It talks about how they continued the legacy of Joshua. In fact, every major big decision the nation has to make in Tanakh, we'll only discuss the big national decisions, are made, almost always made with the elders. For example, when it came to the prophet Samuel, Shmuel, and he's the last of the pre-monarchic leaders, and the people have to tell him that his children can't inherit his position, it's the elders who come and say that. So these elders or judges, they've got both names in Tanakh, they're the continuation of that group that the Torah says has the right to decide how to interpret the law. In fact, they're the only authorized body who have the right to interpret the law in a legally binding way, and also, if they need to legislate. Those are the two authorities they have. In the Second Temple period, we had another name for this group. It's a Greek word. We use the word Sanhedrin. Okay, so and that's the group that has the right to do all of this. So much so, there's nothing in Torah that says once they've ruled that it can't be repealed by a later court. And again, this majority opinion is that that's true. If a Sanhedrin, if one court interpreted the Torah one way, a future one can interpret it differently and say, we disagree with their interpretation. So this raises the question of which, isn't there one true interpretation? Something can't be forbidden and permitted. Surely God wants one over the other. So we'll come back to that point. But this body has these two rights. Now, what happened? Why was there no Mishnah earlier on? For a simple reason. If you didn't know the law, you came to them. Once they ruled on the law, that was binding for that generation. You didn't write it down. People memorized what they needed to know. The judges at the local level knew what the Supreme Court did. It was basically a Supreme Court that was also legislative. And that's what you knew. And if a future court overrides it, then you learn that, and that's what you do. They can debate it as much as they want, but once they've ruled, the ruling is given, and that's the end. What started to happen under Rome, in particular, already it had a little bit of it under Greece, but it was much more intense under Rome, is Rome, as it got more and more entrenched into the daily life of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people here in Israel, in Jerusalem, they began to interfere. And the court system was becoming corrupted and politicized, and different factions were vying for different place on it. And it ended up that it seems that the rabbis lost trust in the ability of the Sanhedrin to actually operate genuinely. And therefore it was no longer seen as authoritative, or the great rabbis themselves could no longer necessarily meet even and vote on the law. And lots of debates started being opened up that were not resolved. Even after the temple was destroyed and the scholars, the rabbis all assembled in Yavne, they weren't all there all the time. Their ability to legislate and decide things was limited. They could do it sometimes, but it wasn't as freely operating as it had been before. And again, many areas are resolved. They make some decrees over there. For example, now that we don't have a temple, we use daily prayer to map the temple service. That was decreed there. There should be the basic structure there, Midah, was decreed there. All these things were done there. But lots and lots and lots of stuff couldn't be determined, couldn't be decided. Either wasn't voted on, wasn't relevant now the temple was destroyed, or just there wasn't a consensus and there wasn't a way to achieve it. And over the next few centuries, or century or so I should say, there basically became, certainly for quite a few decades, there was a lot of unresolved material. Eventually Rabbi Yehuda Nossi assembled all the scholars in northern Israel and had enough wealth, clout with the Roman officials, and the kind of pressure placed on the Jewish people was being released, that he could bring everybody together, vote on what could be voted on, and what wasn't voted on was recorded as a debate, and that became the Mishnah. That became a standard. There were already oral traditions floating around of what debates were not resolved, but now they canonized it as an official text, deliberately chosen to be extremely condensed. They sacrificed clarity for the sake of memorability. And that meant that it needed a lot of unpacking, but it allowed the massive amount of people to hold it in their mind. Now, the unpacking of that was left to the scholars, the rabbis, and that eventually became the job in the Babylonian yeshivas as everything moved there. And again, debates began to develop. They tended to be memorized. In those days, the majority of important information was memorized because a book was handwritten. So if you had the Gemara, it was a handwritten massive scroll. There was no standardized pagination of it. So each yeshiva kept a girsa, kept a copy of it, but people had to, and this before they wrote it all down, people memorized these things. Sometimes they became different traditions. And eventually, it was so gigantic it had to be organized and put together. And Ravina and Rav Ashi put the whole thing together and assembled pretty much the Talmud as we have it now. Okay, again, it was memorized. There was some debates about the precise text. So that's what happens. That's why the Mishnah only appears when it appears, only under the Roman persecution, because there was no need for it beforehand. Because you went to the Sanhedrin and they voted. That's the end of that. Okay, any questions on this so far? What this means is if you believe in Torah, the written Torah, you automatically believe in the authority of the Oral Torah. Yeah.
It would seem really unreasonable to suggest that we didn't need to write things down. Like, there was a lot of people that, specifically at that time in other jurisdictions of the world, people weren't necessarily living all together. Texts would have been sent and broken telephone would have played out. There would be probably significant need to write things down and pass along various authoritative decisions, no?
You may be right. You may be correct that things may have been written down, but there was no need to preserve them. I'll tell you why, because suppose a court just gave a ruling right now, and let's say we had to send it, so presumably letters or some information traveled around the country. Most Jews that were in Israel at the time, okay? But even if it got to the diaspora...
So Israel then is much bigger because it's hard to get around, right?
Yeah, let's say. So it's likely things were transmitted either orally or in a written text, let's say, around. But 2 generations later, the court made a new ruling, so they kept the new text. It wasn't a sacred text, it was just a piece of information like any other letter. There's no reason for that to become something every school kid has to learn off by heart and so. You've got a problem, ask the rabbi. The rabbi knows what the Sanhedrin ruled, right? Or the local judge knows what the Sanhedrin ruled. That's all you need to know. So the complication of having the deliberations of a Sanhedrin that can't vote, that Mishnah, that's something that only occurs under the Roman era. Till then, they argued it out in the room, they voted, and that became the law. And you generally knew what the law was. And if you didn't, you went to a judge who memorize what the laws were, but that was really it. Okay, so the need to write this down and turn it into canonized sacred text that holds, remember, everything they're doing is sacred, everything they're doing is divinely sanctioned. This is God's told you. Now I want to get to the philosophy of why God would want the system to be this way. What does it mean spiritually? And the other question of how you can have more than one opinion that's all true. But people get very tangled in, like, do we have transmission down the different generations? It's irrelevant, right?
And did God tell us to write it down?
No, God didn't tell us to write it down. On the contrary, there's a good reason ideally to avoid writing it down, but there was no other choice. There was no choice because there was no ability to resolve these issues. So now we have to record them, and then we have different courts in the future would have to decide what to do with them. Okay, we wanted to keep them as standard as possible. That's why they have to be a standard memorizable text. These things, there were versions floating around before Rabbi Nossi standardized one. There was as many as I think as 13 different versions, according to the traditions we have. But they chose to standardize one particular one. That would be the one the whole Jewish people will always use. Okay? You can see within itself there were layers. This is what we need to know. Now, why would God want something like this? And there's a few answers to that question. The Maharal of Prague puts it very, very powerfully. In a certain sense, this is the essence of all relationship. Not the essence, but it's a key aspect of all relations. All relationships come with laws. The gap between a law and a relationship is really where the emotions are and what it all means. I'll give you an example of what I mean. If an alien came down from another planet who did not have things that we have, marriage, let's say, and they wanted to study human marriage, and they sent their great anthropologists and psychologists or equivalent thereof down, they would probably conclude or plausibly conclude that what marriage is a massive book of rules and laws. Study the marriage, and I can now articulate within this about several hundred or thousand rules. If you marry somebody that impacts, it's going to have a big impact on what level of religiosity you have. It's going to impact where you live. It's going to impact what your house looks like. It's going to impact how many children you have, how they're brought up. It's going to impact what color carpet you have in your house. It's going to impact what rules you have when you eat meals in the house, what you eat. It's going to impact absolutely everything. Where you go on holiday, when you go on holiday. Everything is regulated by this marriage. It is a multi-volume legal work to try to capture even one marriage's rules and laws, what the penalties are if you break them. A lot of these are never written down, but they're all real. They all exist. Of course, the alien would be missing the essence of marriage. It's the loving relationship. But the deeper love is, the more it filters into every single detail. The deeper, the more important something is, the more it filters into everything. If you're just friends with somebody, then you don't need to worry about how you dress every time you see them. If you're in love, your clothes are going to be impacted by what they say or like or whatever. Everything's going to be impacted by it. And Torah is that. It's the loving bond between God and man where everything matters. I'll just digress on this point because it's worth, before we come back to the Oral Torah thing. You know, people will sometimes say, I get why God would care about things like don't kill and don't steal, but why would he care about, you know, whether you switch a light on Shabbat? Questions like that, right? And of course, you could ask and even, you can reply to somebody like that. I mean, have you heard questions like that before? That's a standard. So you say to somebody, but I could ask an even better question. Why should an infinite creator care whether you kill or steal? After all, let's suppose I gave you some information that on your way here today, you walked past an ant colony destroying another ant colony. There was a genocide next to where you walk today. Right? Are you going to have a sleepless night as a result? Because one ant colony killed another ant. No, why? Because the gap between you and an ant is so big that it doesn't really bother you that much if one ant kills another. So what's bigger, the gap between you and an ant, or the infinite creator of the universe and us? So if your premise is God shouldn't be so petty as to care about light bulbs, why should he be so petty as to care what these little Homo sapiens do on some planet in the middle of the universe? And the answer, of course, is humans can't care about everything. God can. What we're really asking when we say, why is God switching a light? What we're saying is, why doesn't God think like me? I care about killing and stealing. I don't care about light bulbs switching on and off. But God can care about everything. Whether we kill or we steal, whether light bulbs go on and off, whether ants kill each other, where every electron is in the universe. And so the law that we have, and its detail, is the expression of the power of the love between God and us. That's what it is. And it's the expression of the meaningfulness of every single thing we do. Now, in every relationship, there are different aspects. If somebody wants a relationship with any one of you, there is a rule book you come with. You may not be conscious of it, but you have a rule book. It may be you're particular that you'll only marry somebody, right, who's an Orthodox Jew. It may be you're particular that you're only going to marry somebody who speaks English. You may only marry somebody who wants to live in a certain country. But you come with a rule book. And if they're going to marry you, there's certain behaviors they won't be able to do and certain things they will. They'll come with a rule book too. But a rule book, there'll also then be the negotiables. Things that will become structures of the relationship because of who the two of you are. In other words, there's more than one way somebody could have a relationship with you. Okay, so there's things that are non-negotiable, and then there's things that are actually going to be negotiation. Means there's a parameter of possibilities that you come with. And depending who they are and who you are will depend how the relationship is structured and what laws and rules it will then have. Finally, let's suppose you marry somebody and they've got their rules, you've got your dynamics you've built together. There are things you will introduce that they never even asked for. For example, let's suppose they are absolutely particular, everything has to be on time. And you're not a naturally on-time person, and you realize this is going to create a lot of tension in the relationship, so you make a rule you are always 5 minutes early. To prevent problems, you don't come on time, you always come early. And that starts to become part of the rituals and laws of the relationship. Or you don't understand why flowers are important, but she loves them, so you go and get this particular time. You do something more than, right? There she's asked for it, but you might get something that's a little bit more than she's asked for, and that becomes a part of the relationship. That's parallel to these three processes. What the Torah says explicitly and how it's defined is part of what happens. Anybody who would, there's no other way to have a relationship, or for Israel to have, Jewish people to have a relationship with God other than what's black and white. You can't eat a camel, full stop, right? You can't steal, full stop. These are the non-negotiables. Then there becomes interpretation where there is more than one possible way to have a relationship with God. Not everything is possible. The interpretation is not open to every single possibility. There are delineated possibilities, some things, but within them is more than one possibility. That's what the rabbis can argue over. I can interpret the text this way, I can interpret the text that way. And finally comes the legislation where we say to God, this matters, we don't want to mess this up, so we're going to put a barrier in. We're going to nationally put a barrier in. The elders say, so for example, meat and milk you can't have together, can't cook it together, so we'll put a barrier in. Chicken plays the exact same role that meat does socially, and therefore we're going to not have chicken and milk as well. Okay, so that's a legislation. That could only be repealed, any of these can only be repealed by another court. In fact, legislation is slightly harder to repeal, but that's a small technical matter. And until we have another Sanhedrin, we are now left with the last rulings of the last Sanhedrin and the unresolved debates around them. And the Talmud, even though it wasn't quite a Sanhedrin, since it had all the scholars of the generation there, all the elders and judges, more or less, we treat it with the authority like a Sanhedrin. If they rule definitively on something, we take that as a rule. If not, then we have to work out how to extract the law from the debate. Okay? So the Talmud becomes much more than just a book of law. It becomes a book of those who represent Israel in the dialogue and relationship with God. What is the thinking and the dynamics and the possibilities of the relationship between man and God? And we study it not even just to extract the law, but to, so to speak, understand the thinking behind it. Every time we don't just ask, what is the law? What is the reason for the law? What is the other possible way of seeing this? And we even study opinions that don't become the law, because they're also part of the dynamics of the relationship between man and God. In fact, it's a journey into the mind of God and the mind of the scholars, of the elders of Israel, how they understand what God would want as well. And that's what we're doing. When we study Talmud, we are tuning ourselves into, if you like, the mind of God. It's like in a relationship, if something is very important to our spouse and we don't value it, so we say, you know what, I'm not going to do it. That's not much of a relationship. There's a much higher level where I say, I'll do it even though I don't understand it. But there's an even higher level where I say, I'll do it whether I understand it or not. But I want to understand it, not as a condition for me doing it, but so I understand how they think. I want my brain to be sensitive to the things they're sensitive to, tuned into what they're tuned into. And that way, I become more aligned with them, and everything, my entire relationship is enhanced. So I may be studying one thing they like and I get why they see it that way, but on a much deeper level, my neurons just became much more aligned with theirs. I get their world more. And now everything else I do is slightly improved and slightly more tuned into them. So this is why this is crucial. I'm going to spend, the other question, sorry.
I'm just, one of the things you mentioned is that we can't make any updates to the legislation or the interpretation of the laws unless we have a Sanhedrin or any related court.
Yeah.
But isn't the whole thing that you said at the beginning is that God wants us in our times to be able to do that? And aren't we actively going against what God wants by not having that in our times when we have Israel?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right in one sense, that we definitely suffer by not having it.
Yeah.
There's a very important Meshach Chochmah who goes through the whole thing. That's part of being in exile. Exile is, you're basically stuck with this. You don't have exactly the same level of relationship with God. And part of being...
But we follow Babylonian Talmud that was in exile.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So why
Because
can't we have that?
oh, you're right. There could have been. There's a type of exile where you're all together in one place with one central yeshiva for the whole people, where God's basically giving you the ability to still do all this, and then God scatters you and you no longer have
Right,
that
to my
ability.
understanding, that's a population thing. We're above 50% now. We could have one, no?
If the scholars, if all the big rabbis could all agree, then you could restore it. You're right. It would. Most people wouldn't want to restore it for two reasons.
Okay, why?
Right now, we would probably not have a consensus of who should sit on it. And second of all, if it would be reinstituted, we have the problem of then who's got the authority in the state of Israel. Because every religious person would have to follow the Sanhedrin, not the government. And that could create chaos. They're going to start punishing secular Jews. It's just, we're not there yet. And maybe it's sad that we're not there yet nationally, right? The prerequisites of the Jewish nation becoming more unified and connected to God are they're not just technical prerequisites. You have to realize these are not just technicalities. They're talking to us about where we're still failing. We're not unified enough. We're not all close enough to one another and to God to do this yet. That's got to hurt us. Okay, that's part of our national mission. But right now we're not ready for it. Okay, let me spend just a few more minutes talking about this disputes in the Talmud, because there's something very beautiful that comes out of all of this. If there's no more questions on this so far, if there are, you can feel free to ask. Yeah.
Would we not ideally want to transmit it orally, as in, even though it has been written down and that is where it comes from, wouldn't it be like more Jewish or more in God's will for us to try and learn everything orally?
You mean from the beginning? We do try and learn it. You mean even now
Like
we transmit
now.
the Talmud orally? We do, but if you don't have a written official text somewhere, an oral transmission Chinese whisper slips in. Right? And if something's not written, as it is with the Talmud, because it was transmitted orally for a very long time, we do have a Chinese whispers issue. The Jerusalem Talmud, much more so. Babylonian, there's been a lot of effort to fix it up, and there's always been an effort to preserve it very precisely. Jerusalem has a little bit less, and as a result, we don't have a standard 100% agreed upon text actually of it. We have close enough that we can use it. The Babylonian Talmud, we know where there's disputes over certain textual things. So Chinese whispers is a major problem.
What's Chinese whispers?
Chinese whispers is like if I whisper in your ear something, you whisper in the next person,
right.
it will, in transmission, it'll get lost. That's why you need written versions of it. But you are right. Ideally, where you'd have a Sanhedrin voting and deciding, each one would redecide. You never have a canonized fixed text. It would build a fluidity and a flexibility into the relationship with God. That we don't have. We still have it to some degree, because what we do still have is that when a new technology arises or a new social circumstance arises, we have enough material to work off, at least the great people of the Jewish people do, the people who we assume would have been on a Sanhedrin, that they can use that. And it's amazing enough, the Talmud has enough that when there's never yet been a new technology, a new situation that you can't derive from it, the law. Okay, it's so much material and there's so many pathways and so much abstraction that we're able to apply it to every single situation that's ever arisen. And to this day, as new technologies emerge, you see the rabbinic writings, the always go right back to the Talmud and start through then, and the commentaries on it, and the commentaries on the commentaries, till they can extract the law. Okay, let me talk a little bit about this concept of debate and why debate is actually a very beautiful thing, and what it reveals about the Torah, and why God therefore said it isn't all going to be transmitted, but there will be a body that can make the decisions. And the Talmudic phrase for this is called Elu va'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. These and these are both the words of the living God. And that comes from the first major schism that emerged, again in the Roman era, before the destruction of the temple, between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. Shammai was in charge of the Bet Din. He was meant to be the president of the Sanhedrin. Hillel was the Nasi, the kind of prince of the Jewish people. It wasn't just a political position, it was also spiritual. And they were the two great people. But again, they themselves couldn't assemble the legitimate scholars together to debate on things except in a few instances. And so their students began to enormously dispute large areas of Jewish law. And there's 3 years that the Talmud says there was 3 years where they themselves had debates and where the scholars debated. And eventually this heavenly echo comes out, however we understand this, and says, these and these are the words of the living God, and the law should follow the school of Hillel. Now, there's a lot of questions you can ask, right? One is, how can these and these both be the words of the living God? Although hopefully we've begun to answer that. The second is, if it is both the words of the living God, why should the law follow Hillel? Okay, there's other questions as well, but those two are the ones that I want to really focus on. What does it mean, these and these are the words of the living God? So, I've already kind of answered it with the analogy of a relationship. There may be these and these could both be ways to have a relationship with this person. For one person, if you have a relationship with him, you shouldn't do this. For another person, can. Another good analogy for this is if you shine a light through a prism. So if you're standing on one side of the prism, you will see a white light. But if you are smaller than, if you're only stuck on the other side of the prism, and it fragments into red all the way to blue, right, or to violet, and you're small, let's say the size of an insect, if you're in the red light, you behave one way. If you're in the blue light, you behave another way. So there's more than one answer that the light gives. It depends where you stand relative to it. Okay? Conceptually, you might say the same spiritually. If you're spiritually of this kind of makeup, this would be the ideal. If you're spiritually of a different type of makeup, this would be the ideal way to have a relationship with God. In other words, what did Moses say in the particular law? Moshe knew there were complex entities, aspects of this and aspects of that. And the idea of the 70 elders is they represent spiritually the people. The people have to behave in one way. How should the people behave? If the majority of them are near the red light, if the majority of their represented bodies in the red light, then they should treat it like it's red. If they're in the blue, they should treat it like it's blue. But both are true. If you want to understand the light God is shining, you have to see both. Okay? I'll give you a very specific example with Hillel and Shammai, just because those of you who started learning will have come across them probably more than anybody else. Okay, so what do Hillel and Shammai argue about? What's the basic theme of their arguments, would you say, if any of you have been doing any learning?
Follow things strictly or leniently.
Right, usually people assume, and it's generally correct, that Shammai and his school are more strict, and Hillel and his school are more lenient, and that's a good rule. However, it's not a 100% rule.
Right.
There is an entire chapter of Mishnah about the cases where that's reversed, where Hillel is strict and Shammai is lenient, and so on. And then there are laws that have absolutely nothing to do with strict and lenient. Nothing. For example, even rabbinic laws, like Hanukkah. We're coming up in a few weeks to Hanukkah. Hanukkah is when we light the menorah. Every night of the 8 nights of Hanukkah, we light lights. And the law is really only one light has to be lit in a household. But if you want to be a mahadran, real beautifiers of the law, then you should do it in a particular way. What we do is we follow Hillel. On the first night of Hanukkah, we light how many lights? One, and then we increase 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Everyone's familiar. But Shammai had a different view. They said the right way that it should have been done is the reverse. Start with 8, go down to 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, like the way the offerings are done on Sukkot in the temple. Now, that would be an interesting, but that's got nothing to do with strict or lenient. What are they arguing over? And there's many other examples. I'll give you another example that would be familiar. If you're familiar with Havdalah, with the ceremony that brings out Shabbat, you're familiar that we hold up a light, usually a few candles intertwined, and we say a bracha, a blessing, bless you Hashem, who created Borei Ma'orei Ha'esh, who created the plural, the lights, plural of fire. Shammai doesn't like that. He says what you should really say is Borei Ma'or Ha'esh. God created the light, singular. Like, what are they arguing over? And there's many examples. And there's different, throughout the generations, people have said it in different ways, this point. I'm going to use it the way Rabbi Zevin wrote about it, which is easy to grasp. He says Shammai is always the world of potential. If you like how things look in heaven. What things potential can be. Even the name Shammai is similar to the name Shammai in heaven. What's the potential? Hillel is how the world actually is. That they look at the law from that perspective. Now both perspectives are true and important, but Shammai wants to kind of see what is the potential in something. Hillel wants to see is how does it actually come out. So usually the potential of something will lead you to something, to a stricter standard than how it actually comes out, which is why usually Shammai will be stricter. However, let's take the Hanukkah example. This is a really good example. On the first night of Hanukkah, there was the story, I assume most of you are basically familiar with the story. They arrive at the temple at some point, there's not enough pure oil to light, but they decide to light anyway. In heaven at that point, how much potential was this jar of oil given on the first night of Hanukkah? How many days was it now potentially able to light for? 8. On the second night of Hanukkah, how much potential was this given? 7, then 6, then 5. You see, its potential was being diminished because it had been used. So the first night is 8, so they say like 8 lights. On the second night, 7, then 6, then 5, then 4, then 3, 2, 1. Hillel says 1 second. We want to look at everything by how it actually comes out. On the first night, it actually lit for 1 night. second light for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's a great example. They're both the words of the living God. One's looking at it from the blue light, one's looking from the red light. You need to see the whole picture. And similarly, blessed are the lights of fire. Shammai says there was only one potential creation of light right at the beginning. So he says the blessing should be God who made the light of fire, created the potential, and that's it. Hillel says, but in the actual world, every single light is different. Lights of fire. And there's many other examples. Why do I use that example? Because that's what Eilu Veilu, these are both the words of the living God. There's more than one possible way to interpret Torah and to use a similar way of viewing rabbinic law and everything. And they're both pieces of the puzzle, the red light and the blue light. They're both important. They're both part of what God wants us to see. Now, the law can only follow one. And the Talmud says the real reason the law follows Hillel were very humble, and they would teach Shammai's words with their own. In fact, if you would go and ask them a question, they would always quote to you Shammai's school first. You'd say, what is the law? They would say, before I give you the law, you should know that Shammai says this, we say this. Why is that? Why should that make the law their way? Because they were sensitive, much more so, to the idea that we know both sides to build the picture. The Torah is multifaceted. It has many different aspects to it. And any one of them can become the interpretation of the Torah. In fact, we speak about there being 70 faces of Torah. And there's 70 elders on the Sanhedrin. So they represent as many faces as possible. And that becomes the law. And that's why we study the law, even the law that didn't become binding on us, we still want to study it because it's also an aspect of Torah. So let's reverse and go through everything we've said. We started with the issue of, yes, there's belief in the written Torah, but as Orthodox Jews, we keep the oral Torah. In fact, almost all Jews today, in one form or another. And we discussed what is this oral Torah? How do we know it's true? And I pointed out that really people get very confused by this question. Really what the oral Torah is 3 different things. The Halacha LaMoshe Sinai, the law Moses received at Sinai, that's the actual orally transmitted part of Torah. And that's really just the definitions of words in the Torah. Nobody can doubt there had to be such a transmission. Right? There is only one possibility. There were definitions and people knew what Totavos meant, people knew what work on Shabbat meant, etc. Then come the next 2 categories: how to interpret the Torah when it's not black and white, not absolutely unambiguous, like it says again, you can't eat camel, you can't eat pig, that's black and white. But then it says you can't cook meat in its mother's milk. Does that include any animal that gives milk? Does that include only the mother and child? What is that? You could interpret it in different ways. So we need to have interpretation. And then there's the ability to legislate, and both of those come directly from the Torah itself. In other words, the moment you believe in the Torah, you believe it's divinely written. So then Devarim chapter 17, Deuteronomy 17 is divinely written, and it tells you exactly what to do when something is not clear. Get up and go to the judges who will be there, and what they tell you to do, how they interpret the Torah, and what they instruct you to do, that's what you've got to do. And that is why we never needed a Mishnah for centuries. And only when that became impossible to do, did we start needing to record the deliberations of the non-meeting Sanhedrin, and that became Mishnah, became Talmud, until eventually we spread out and we could no longer even add really to that textual material. And that's what we call the Oral Torah today. But all of this is the portal to the dynamics of the relationship between man and God. Like in every relationship, you have what you bring to the relationship, a bunch of laws. You have what can be negotiated within the relationship. There's more than one possibility, and to understand you really well would help to understand more than one possibility. And then there's what each person then brings beyond what the other one asked them to do, and that's the model of the Oral Torah. And what all this does is more than just become an obligation on us, in as much as any relationships are not obligations. Relationships are the deepest fulfilling things, but these become a part of the Torah. The study of it opens our eyes into, if you like, the thought process behind, so to speak, getting to know the mind of God. Yes?
What would your response be? There are some conservative rabbis that source their tshuvas in the Gemara.
Mm-hmm.
And they, in the same way that an Orthodox rabbi will work backwards to Paskin modern day Halacha, they will do the same to Paskin conservative Halacha.
Yeah.
So how you explain the idea of refracting light of different ways, and we have modern day Halacha that's Paskin recently, so how does that work?
So really, that's not a question limited to conservative rabbi. That's a question about how do rabbis reach conclusions nowadays, right? Now you may...
When they don't have divine authority.
When they don't have divine authority, correct. They don't have divine authority nowadays. Nowadays, no rabbi or we will never follow a rabbi who goes back to the Torah and comes up with a new interpretation from the text and derives a law. They have no authority to do that.
Yeah, so what gives them the right to make halacha?
So the right to make halacha nowadays, they don't make halacha. What they have to do is apply the halacha to given situations. And because the Talmud has not always got a fixed conclusion, and we have throughout the generations rabbis trying to interpret and apply the Torah, and we use that to the best of our ability to this day. Nobody can make up a new interpretation. That doesn't exist. People can legislate for localities. Okay, what usually ends up happening is there'll be a debate amongst rabbis. Some opinions will be rejected, just like in the Talmud itself. Some opinions in the course of the debate, like for example, when electricity first came out, mechanisms were misunderstood. Some people thought there was a fire traveling along a wire. People thought different things, and therefore a lot of the early opinions were eventually treated as invalid because they're based on misunderstandings. Lots of ideas were hypothesized. There became, if you like, a bell curve of mainstream opinions, and pretty much everything in that bell curve, more or less, is that it's forbidden. Some would say biblically, some rabbinically. But everybody seems to agree that it's forbidden, meaning rabbinically, meaning fitting into the categories of the Talmud itself, the things that were legislated or even potentially things that are interpreted. And this is what we call rabbinic, this we call biblical actually. But in one way or another it's forbidden, and that became the emergent consensus. Now, if somebody has a lot of knowledge about the Torah, but you feel about them that they're approaching the text with an agenda, we will usually, it's common sense to say, I want to go to somebody I feel is only approaching this with the authority of God. I'm not going to comment on specific people or movements or anything like that, but obviously it makes sense, and the Talmud itself says this. The Talmud itself says this. It says you should go to a rabbi who appears to you like an angel of God. And it gives other criteria of who should be sitting in these courts, and therefore who should be seen as authority. They have to have a certain base of knowledge. We want to assume that we would look at them as not just an intellectually brilliant person, but also a very angelic type of person, somebody who lives the Torah in a very deep and beautiful way. And the truth is, the way that the Orthodox Jewish world works is very few of the great rabbis have official positions of authority. It's a bit like in the way the medical world works, which is, your doctor knows more than you, so you go to your doctor. When the doctor doesn't know, they go to more senior, and they go to more senior, and they kind of all know who the big three experts in the world are. That's kind of how it works. So, we know when Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was alive, there was a general consensus. He was head and shoulders above everybody. There was maybe two or three others in the generation of his sort of level. And the big questions would really, if they all agreed on something, that would be what everyone would do. And if they disagreed, there'd be more than one possibility. It would have some resemblance of the Talmudic system, but without its formality.
Can I just ask one last?
Sure.
And to the person that says, I understand he may be correct in his regard, but that's not my flavor, that's not my light, that's not my refraction.
Not this talk. There is a very important talk on how we should cite halacha today. Fortunately, the Talmud has given us some rules and guidelines, okay? It's beyond the scope of this talk to go through them, and as with everything Judaism, there's even some debates within that. There is a set of guidelines that we should use, and that's what we've got to use, okay? But I'm more discussing the basic principle of Oral Torah, that was the problem today, yeah.
Just one expansion is that, is it allowed though, like the system of, like similar to how medicine is evolved, is that okay rabbinically? Like, can a rabbi create, because they know a lot about Torah, a ruling based off of interpretation that isn't divinely given to them?
So today we don't have a Sanhedrin. We can't do what they can do.
Well, we
only
can't
have
have a Sanhedrin.
No. So now new technology emerges. IVF comes onto the scene, right? Or AI comes and starts creating all sorts of halachic discussions.
Correct.
So the great authorities of their time have to tell you what you can do, what you can't do, this way or that way. So they will always go back into the core text using the biblical and Talmudic texts first, and then how they've been interpreted. They'll find which ones are the relevant ones. How did the commentaries interpret them? Did consensus emerge over the ages?
I guess
right?
my question is, does God tell us to hold based off of what they say?
Yes. What I mean is that God doesn't explicitly say follow a rabbi. But the Talmud, which had the legislation interpretation, does tell you what to do. First rule is, if you are a big enough expert and you're confident yourself, you can actually decide the law. You've got to be very confident. Because on many, many different levels, you want to make sure you're not biased, you want to make sure you're really holding in everything, because you can know an area of Talmud in one place and the key line actually appears somewhere else. So if you're the great rabbi who's mastered it all, you can decide the law. If you don't have that, then you're meant to have your own rabbi. Aseh lecha rav. It's a part of the oral traditions and teachings. You're meant to make a rabbi who's carries that authority. There's some criteria of who they should be. If you're part of a community, the community rabbi will have that first. Later in life, you may move to another community, or you may find somebody else who's your authority, but they have to have certain criteria. And if they don't know, there's again rules when they follow the majority, rules when they go. When sometimes on biblical law you go stricter, sometimes on rabbinic law. The basic structure is you know it yourself, your rabbi knows it. If none of those are true, you follow the majority. If that's not clear, then on biblical law you go strict, on rabbinic law you go lenient, and then there's a few categories of that. That's the basic matter structure. Okay. We are late on time, so what I'm going to do is take one last question, because I think you've got to talk straight after this, and then if there's like a little break in between this and the next talk, I'm happy to stand around for people who want to ask individual. I think your hand was up the longest, but I might be wrong. Yeah, yours was Shaya. I'm biased to the wonderful Judah, but I think your hand is up first. Sorry, I apologize both of you. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So when it comes to the case of like milk and meat, for example,
Yeah.
and from what I understand in the Torah, the only source would be don't bake a goat in its mother's milk.
Yeah.
Would that fall into Halacha Moshe Sinai or interpretation?
There's actually different aspects fall into each, but that broadly speaking is more like interpretation.
So could it be that law, meaning like Moshe would have no problem mixing milk and meat like as a whole?
Mixing cold milk and meat was a legislation. It was. It's not. Cooking them together is the biblical
Even cooking
prohibition.
them together, like meat, like in the Torah it just says go and it's
So the Rambam says, what happens if were there interpretations Moshe himself had? The answer is yes. He would definitely have ruled on that. Which way he'd have ruled, we don't know. But anything that comes in the category of interpretation, another court later on could change. When it comes to legislation, it's a little bit harder to change. So yeah, there were definitely Jews answering that question every generation, no question. And likely, you usually have deference to generations that came before you, right? That's a likely instinct. You'll often see questions where somebody will say in biblical, in Tanakh, they're doing this, but isn't that against what the Gemara rules? So they're assuming the Talmud is based on a tradition, they were continuing all the way back there. You could just answer and say they interpreted it differently, right? Again, there's black and white things you can't interpret. This in the actual text of Torah, no interpretation. In fact, if a court rules wrongly, they'd have to whole repentance procedure. But this, that's the bit where it's open. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Hopefully it's been helpful to you, and I'll stick around.